Hey y'all, welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time watching, my name is Ashley and I'm the owner of Trinity Tallow Soap Co. Today I would like to show everyone how I render my grass-fed suet tallow. That is the #1 ingredient in all of my skincare and my soaps. If that's something you'd be interested in learning, just click that like button and also stick around for the video coming up next. Okay, so I've got a big chunk of my suet tallow out now. I am ready to start chopping this up and putting it into my food processor. The reason I am putting it into my food processor is because my supplier does not have a grinder and they do not grind their suet for me, neither does their butcher. And I would rather do this myself than take it to a local butcher that doesn't do exclusively grass-fed or has a bunch of meat or sausage or anything else left in their grinder from the previous grind. So I like to put it in my food processor and blend it down. What I do the day before I am ready or the morning of the day I'm ready to render, I will take my suet out of the freezer and put it into the fridge. I still want this suet mostly frozen because when I put it in here into the grinder and grind it up, especially in the summertime, if it is not frozen or mostly frozen, it's going to make a big mess and it's going to melt because this is fat. It's going to melt and be very hard to get out of your food processor. It's still doable, you just have to work at it a whole lot more. And the whole purpose of me putting it in the food grinder in the first place is so this will render faster. So the less work I have to do, the better. So I keep it frozen, that way when I grind it, it just dumps out like a powder. Okay, so I piece up my suet first, and it is a little bit more time consuming doing it this way initially, piecing it up rather than putting a huge chunk in my stainless steel turkey roaster and then putting it in the oven. But a big chunk like this, even if I pieced this in 4, it's gonna take a really long time for that to melt down in the oven and potentially burn in spots. And we don't want that to happen because burnt suet has a burnt tallow smell that is almost impossible to get rid of unless you're just gonna soap with it and be done with it. This is for luxurious tallow products that I don't want to have to over fragrance with essential oils. I want to be able to use it with no essential oils and use it in anything I want to and not worry about having a burnt meat smell. Okay, after I get my tallow pieced up this much, usually I try to leave as much room in the top of my food processor so it'll give it room because you'll see it's going to expand. I'm going to put my lid on and just pulse it. And you see, because it's frozen, it's bouncing the food processor. You're going to need a heavy duty quality food processor for this. Okay, and there may be some pieces that need to go back and be done again because it gets stuck. I try to get as much of the gristle and the fascia out as possible when I'm piecing them up if I see any. Typically my suppliers have really healthy, clean suet that I don't really have to do very much meat digging and fascia digging out because they, give me pretty clean suet most of the time unless I'm taking some with a little bit of skin fat around. That's the trim fat. I usually don't get very much of that where I have to piece off a bunch of the fascia and the meat. But what I mean by that is you'll see this piece right here that's got a good bit of fascia attached to it. This is what will render cracklings. If you are familiar with pork lard, that has a lot of cracklings in it. Beef tallow doesn't typically, when it's from the suet, it doesn't usually have a whole lot of this attached to it, but this will get caught up in your blade in your food processor, and it will render a bunch of cracklings in the final product that can, if it's got a bunch of meat attached to it, leave a smell in your tallow. So I just try to get as much of this out as I possibly can so that's not in the final product. All right, I've got all of the suet ground up, and now I'm ready for the next step. I do the wet rendering method where I add distilled water and salt to purify the tallow down to get all the impurities out. And I use sea salt, and I don't measure anymore. I used to, but I don't do that anymore. So I just sprinkle on top some salt. It's a couple of tablespoons, and I don't measure my water either. I don't do that anymore. And I like the wet method because it ensures that I can get my tallow super clean, and it helps not burn the tallow in the melting process. So I just fill it up, a couple of cups. Now I'm going to put this in the oven on 200, and it's going to be between 6 and 8 hours approximately before I do my first strain, and then I will come back and let it re-solidify and do this process all over again a couple of times, and I'll bring you back to see that next part. Okay, so it's been about 4 hours, and I'm gonna go ahead and strain this the first time just to get some of this liquid off so it can finish rendering before I need to go to bed. And I'm filtering it through an extra fine cheesecloth and a stainless steel strainer. And whatever little bits of tallow pieces that remain that still haven't been melted, I'll add it back into the pot so it can finish rendering. Okay, I've gotten it back down, strained as much as I'm comfortable with for now to leave some of that water in there still. And I'm gonna put it back in the oven for several more hours and see. Up to that point, I may go in with my potato ricer and press to see how much more liquid I can get out of it. And then we will go from there to see how much more we can get. We're still on render number 1. I did not have enough time in the day to finish this yesterday to get it all the way rendered out. This still, I could still render down. So I'm putting it back in the oven, and I am going to continue to let this go until I can't filter any more of that out without having the little bristly parts clog up my filter. But I will continue to press and get more out until I can no longer do that without it clogging up my filter. And I'll bring you back to see the next part when I get to that step. Okay, I've got most of those out now, and I'm just letting the last little bit drain out of the bottom of this. And I am working now on cleaning out my vessel. I am going to use a really good soap to clean it all out, first wiping it down with a paper towel. If you prefer not to use paper towels due to environmental concerns, what I would suggest is getting some microfiber towels and wiping it out really well with this. I have run out of clean microfiber towels, and when you do use something like a microfiber towel to clean this out, you're going to want to make sure you get as much of it off, like the little bits, before you put this in your washing machine, because tallow can clog your washing machine. So you will want to make sure you're using a really good, I prefer a non-toxic detergent, but not really a detergent, it's a surfactant. And make sure that you use it on high heat on your water cycle. That way it doesn't cause any issues with your washing machine or your actual laundry machine. So I'm just going to continue wiping it out. just to get as much of this out as I can. You definitely don't want any of this going down your drain because it can clog your drain. And then I will stick all my utensils down in here and clean it out and get it ready for the next step, where the tallow goes back in here with more water and more salt to begin the first purification step. Okay, so I've had this in my freezer for about an hour just to get it all set up. What I'm gonna do is take a butter knife and go around the edges, maybe not all the way around, but just try to break that seal. Sometimes when I do this, if it hasn't frozen solid, sometimes an hour is not quite enough. It'll bust up in pieces like this. And so the top section is pretty clean. What I'll do is just put it back in the roaster over here to the other side where you can't see. But I'm doing this over by the sink because typically there is a layer of water at the bottom of this that all the impurities and salt are sitting at. And so when I flip this over, I like to flip it over in the sink. That way if anything comes out, it comes out into the sink instead of all over the counter. Now I don't do a whole lot of water where that is a big problem, but enough that it would make a mess and be hard to clean up, or a pain to clean up anyway. And I'm just taking these chunks. Obviously I didn't let it sit in there and freeze long enough because now it's trying to come off in big chunks. But I'm just gonna roll with it because it's gonna be cleaned again anyway. That's a pretty clean tallow cake right there. Hopefully you can see. That's a probably 11 or 12 pound tallow cake. So far I'm not seeing a whole lot that I'm needing to scrape off. I just need to wipe it down. I'll bring you over to the other side in just a second to show you how I do that before I add it back to the turkey roaster. Okay, so I have a cleaned out turkey roaster from prior when I had all of that in the oven and it was dirty, so I cleaned it out, and that's where all those little tallow pieces are going back into. Here's my tallow cake. It came out really clean. I made sure I got a lot of that, all of the impurities out the first time when I was chopping it all up and putting it in my food processor. That way I wouldn't have to clean off nearly as much. So now I'm just drying it off because there is still water in this, and there is going to be a process for getting this water out of here. You want to make sure that you get all the water out. However, when you're doing your purification processes, we still put water and we still put some salt the first 2 times. And then from there, I will stop adding water and stop adding salt. But for right now, I'm gonna piece this back up and put it back in the roaster, and it's going to melt back down. You might be able to see on the inside where there's some lightly pink colored water. Those are impurities in there. We've got to get that out. Once we get that out, or once we get that melted back down with some more water and more salt, it's going to draw that water and salt mixture with the impurities to the bottom of the tallow cake. And just as I did before, where I flipped over the bowl over by the sink, there will be more water and more impurities on the bottom of the tallow cake the next go around, and that's a purification process. All right, now that I've got it all pieced up and now that my countertop is nice and greasy, this second time I'm gonna add some salt, not as much as I did the first, maybe just 2 tablespoons of salt, and go back in with some water. Maybe a little bit more water this time than I did last time so I can get those impurities out just to come on out a little easier. And then back in the oven. So now that we have the tallow cake out, we are going to go into our second purification process. I dumped it out, and then typically you'll see dirty water down in here, and that's where the impurities go. And a lot of it fell out into the sink, but you can see it's a little bit discolored. So we've gotten it pretty clean after the first initial rendering, and then this one purification step. I'm gonna go ahead and do another purification step to get that water completely clean. A lot of times, if your tallow was not clean to begin with, and you left a lot of gristly bits in there, this whole top will be a brown color, where you will see a bunch of the salt and water leaving impurities on top. But I took care of cleaning mine so well when I was piecing it up that I didn't allow any meat or gristly bits to get into my tallow while it was rendering down. So this has yielded a whole lot cleaner product than what would if you just put everything in a pot and let it all melt down. So it really saves you a lot of steps from having to sit here and scrape all of it out. And what I will do now is just, as I did before, piece it back up and put it back in the roaster, again in the oven with more salt and more water, and melt it back down. And after this, we will do it one more time with no water and no salt, just to get out every bit of extra water that's in it. And I will filter it into a glass jar. That way I can see the line of water at the bottom and be sure to pour everything that is tallow and separate the water off and leave that for cooking or something else. I will not let any water get into that final rendering. That way I can use this for anything that doesn't have a preservative. With soap, it doesn't really matter. You can leave the water in there as long as you're gonna put this in the freezer, because soap has such a high pH when you make it. It's not gonna matter if there's water in it, but you will have to put it in the freezer. You won't be able to leave it out. It won't be shelf stable if there's water in it at all. But for anything like whipped tallow butters, or, you know, chapsticks, or lotion bars, anything that's not supposed to have water in it can't have water in it. Otherwise, you would need to use a preservative, and I don't want to have to do that. So I'm going to make sure that when I get this all taken care of after this last purification step, I'm going to make sure that there's absolutely no water in it at all. And you'll be able to see that when I come back and show you how I pour it off into the glass jar. So we are at purification process number 3, and we have completely rendered down and purified for 4 full steps. You may not be able to see in the pot very well. Let me see if I can angle you a little bit better. Down in there, there is little bits of what looks like impurity particles at the very bottom of my pan, and that is what I do not want to get into my final rendering. This last time that I put it in for purification, I did not put any salt and I did not put any extra water. Nothing went in but the tallow. And so this time all I wanted to do was get out all of those final impurities and get out every last little drop of water that might possibly be in there. And what I'm doing is I'm filtering out everything that I just melted down into a glass jar. That way I can see at the bottom the water and oil separate. So far I have not gotten to any water at the bottom at all. That's usually in the bottom of this. A lot of times I can actually see it where it separates here at the bottom, but this, unfortunately for this video, this has been very clean, so I don't really have a good example to show you. But once I separate it into here and make sure when I'm pouring it off, if I were to see any water, I would stop pouring at the point of where I saw the water and oil separate. That way I would make sure that none of the water went into the final batch. And so that's the final process of this whole step in rendering this completely, where we have odorless, pure, clean tallow. So all I will do now is make sure this very bottom part does not get into here. And the way I will do that is by rendering it or filtering it through into here and then pouring off just till I can see the little spots in the bottom of the glass jar where it looks dirty, and I will not pour from here anymore into here, where all that will be left is pure, clean tallow.